If you were ever skeptical of John F. Kennedy's assassination being an inside job, this is the story that could change your mind. Welcome to what many believe to be the most convincing of all JFK conspiracy theories. Before we talk about the evidence, and there is tons of it that may surprise even our most skeptical viewers, we need to talk a little bit about the motive. Why would the CIA, perhaps with various other officials of the American government, want to take out their own president? After all, if found guilty, it's a crime that would disgrace America forevermore. The risk involved was monumental, so there had to be a very, very big reason to go through with such a risky and treasonous plan. So we'll start our story in Cuba, Veradero Beach to be exact, about 2 hours from the capital of Havana. The French journalist Jean Daniel is having lunch in the living room of the summer residence of the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, a man the CIA went to almost ridiculous lengths to try to assassinate. At about 1:30 p.m. Cuban time, the phone rings. The news from the other end is that someone had tried to assassinate John F. Kennedy. Castro and Daniel had already talked quite a lot about Kennedy before they received that news. The Cuban leader had pointed out he was reassured by how JFK and the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had been getting along so well, and that they were possibly working to effectively end the Cold War. At one point, Castro told Daniel, "I know that for Khrushchev, Kennedy is a man you can talk with. I've gotten this impression from all my conversations with Khrushchev." Castro told him that he was looking forward to working with Kennedy once the president secured a second term. This was a man the CIA despised. So when news outlets confirmed that Kennedy was dead, Castro, according to Daniel, was very solemn. Castro turned to him and said, "Everything has changed. Everything is going to change." It certainly did. There were to be no more peace talks with the Soviet Union, that's for sure. The Cold War would rage on for many more years. On March 13, 1962, the United States Army General Lyman Lemnitzer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presented a plan to the Secretary of Defense, a man JFK trusted, Robert McNamara. Like many of the people working in the highest echelons of the American military and intelligence, Lemnitzer wanted to invade Cuba. Nonetheless, to do that, the U.S. would need a good reason, so Lemnitzer introduced Operation Northwoods to McNamara. This plan pretty much sums up the kind of people that surrounded Kennedy. Operation Northwoods was what was called a false flag operation, a fabricated event in which a fake hostile action requires an offensive response. Lemnitzer wanted to attack the U.S. military bases and blame it on the Cubans. Among the bullets and bombs, U.S. intelligence propagandists would spread rumors on the radio about this vicious attack on innocent Americans. They would hire friendly Cubans to walk around close to the attacks in Cuban military uniforms. They'd then pretend to capture those men. There would be fires set, aircrafts burned, installations bombed, ships attacked, and later even funerals for mock victims. Lemnitzer said they would publish casualty lists in all the biggest newspapers, along with sad stories to get enough popular support to start an invasion of Cuba. In Part 4 of the proposal, he wrote, "We could develop a communist Cuba terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even Washington." He said there would be wounding of innocent people to be widely publicized. They would want to explode a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots. U.S. citizens would be outraged, and of course, they'd say, "Yeah, go kill those commie terrorist bastardos." As crazy as that all sounds, it was par for the course. Such subversion was not unusual during the Cold War. Lemnitzer said all the Joint Chiefs were on board with the plan, and the CIA was firing on all cylinders to make it happen. They believed the evil communists had to be stopped at any cost, which is partly why the CIA committed or encouraged human rights abuses all over the world during the Cold War. This was the political environment JFK entered when he was elected president. To appreciate the JFK assassination conspiracy theory, you have to understand what lengths certain people in the U.S. military and intelligence would go to. Kennedy dismissed Operation Northwoods, telling Lemnitzer and other key advisors he could not foresee anything in the near future that would justify and make desirable use of the American forces to overt military action in Cuba. This is all well documented, as is everything we'll tell you today. JFK was isolated in his own government, according to the conspiracy theory. He'd already lost support among many of his advisors after the 1961 Bay of Pigs incident, when the CIA secretly sent 1,400 Cuban exiles that they'd trained into Cuba. Kennedy was a much younger president, one with different ideas about how to carry out politics. This plan had been drawn up during the Eisenhower administration before him, and even though JFK would go on to dismiss similar plans during his term, at the end of the day, he was expected to do what he was told. This all started when Castro's forces overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. The CIA now wanted to throw Castro out, just as they'd covertly done with success to leaders in Iran and Guatemala, with plenty of assassinations along the way. To get the job done, Cuban exiles were trained by the U.S. at guerrilla training camps in Guatemala. American involvement was supposed to be kept secret, which did not happen. The whole thing was a total disaster. Castro's troops won and then captured many of the exiles. Kennedy later told friends that the Bay of Pigs was a trap. The older men around him had thought that he'd be drawn into sending troops in. He told his friends Dave Powers and Ken O'Donnell they were sure I'd give in to them. He added they couldn't believe a new president like me wouldn't panic. He said they had me figured out all wrong. JFK did not trust many of the older guys who advised him, and especially the CIA director Allen Dulles. Dulles admitted in memoirs found after his death that the plan was always to get Kennedy to send in troops rather than permit the enterprise to fail. Instead, JFK handed Cuba $53 million worth of baby foods and medicine in exchange for the prisoners Castro had taken. It was a total embarrassment, and while JFK gave the green light on assassination plans for Castro, he still had to keep pushing back the hawks around him that kept telling him to invade Cuba. Then there was Vietnam. The U.S. had been active in Vietnam for years. In 1954, Vice President Richard Nixon said, if the French withdrew, the United States might have to take the risk now by putting our own boys in. The CIA later helped French forces through its Saigon military mission, SMM, directing paramilitary campaigns against the communists and assisting with propaganda. The U.S. even considered using tactical nukes on Vietnam to help the embattled French under Operation Vulture. Much later, in May 1961, JFK agreed to send 500 Special Forces troops and military advisors to help the pro-Western government of South Vietnam. A year later, close to 11,000 American military advisors were working in South Vietnam, and of course, Kennedy approved that. The Americans did not want the communists overrunning Southeast Asia. So, under JFK, U.S. presence did indeed increase. But Kennedy would soon start thinking differently about Vietnam. He was under a lot of pressure to send actual combat troops to Vietnam. As the Pentagon Papers later showed, he was willing to send in advisors and let the CIA do what it needed to do, but he was against sending in units capable of independent combat. The Pentagon Papers, by the way, were thousands of pages of top-secret Department of Defense actions up until 1968 in Indochina. They were released in 1971 and showed the American public a very different side to military America, which would include secret campaigns in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and result in many thousands of dead civilians. The CIA was out of control, which likely wouldn't have happened had JFK not been taken out. That's what the conspiracy theorists think. Daniel Ellsberg, the military analyst and activist behind the Pentagon Papers, had always been unsure about where Kennedy had stood on Vietnam. It didn't seem to make sense to him, sending in more men yet remaining reluctant to send in the combat troops. So he asked JFK's brother Robert Kennedy, RFK, when he got the chance to in 1967. RFK, soon to be assassinated in 1968, too told him that his brother had rejected the urgent advice of every one of his top military and civilian officials, which was to send in troops. Years later, Ellsberg recorded this conversation and said that this is what RFK had said when he was asked why his brother wouldn't send in the combat troops. RFK said, "Because we already were there in 1951. We saw what was happening to the French. We saw it. My brother was determined to never let that happen to us." JFK knew what would happen partly because of the Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield, who he'd sent on a fact-finding mission to South Vietnam in 1962. Mansfield returned and told JFK that getting into a war in Vietnam would be a mistake. JFK later signed a National Security Action Memorandum 217, which forbade high-ranking military and civilian personnel from going to South Vietnam without State Department clearance. This rattled the Pentagon. JFK told Mansfield he was thinking about a full withdrawal from Vietnam, but he would wait. His actual words were, "But I can't do that until 1965 after I'm re-elected. If he tried before, he'd be criticized by the conservatives and might lose some of their vote." JFK told his friend and consultant, a man we mentioned earlier, Kenneth O'Donnell, "In 1965, I'll become one of the most unpopular presidents in history. I'll be damned everywhere as a communist appeaser, but I don't care." McNamara later surprised the military hierarchy in a meeting in Honolulu when he told them 1,000 military personnel were to be withdrawn from South Vietnam by the end of the calendar year 63. McNamara told them to draw up concrete plans. It seems the military had other ideas. After JFK's death, Those combat troops were sent en masse. This happened when U.S. officials and subsequently the media said there'd be an unprovoked attack on American vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. But the facts about this attack were at best manipulated and at worst totally contrived. They served as a pretext to go to war with Vietnam. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, written by Congress, gave the president virtually unlimited power to do whatever he wanted in Southeast Asia, a power that was very much exercised by both Lyndon B. Johnson and later Richard Nixon. Almost 200 documents that the National Security Agency, or NSA, declassified in 2005 and 2006 show us that Congress was misled. We won't go into all the details today, but what was said and what happened were two very different things. And at the time, the misinformation was enough to make war with Vietnam look justifiable. But JFK's Vietnam withdrawal plan wasn't everything. In July 1993, a Canadian newspaper, through a Freedom of Information request, had 21 secret letters that were written between JFK and Khrushchev declassified. They talked about mountains and lakes and other beautiful things, and they also talked about atomic weapons and the destruction of the world. In one letter, Khrushchev compared their situation to the mythological Noah's Ark, saying they might see each other as clean and unclean, but in the bigger scheme of things, they were on the same ark together and wanted the same thing. They didn't want to blow the whole world up. JFK replied, saying he liked that analogy, adding, "Whatever our differences, our collaboration to keep the peace is as urgent, if not more urgent, than our collaboration to win the last World War." They might have been on friendly terms in those letters, but that didn't stop the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Americans deployed missiles in Italy and Turkey, the Soviets deployed ballistic missiles in Cuba. This was fighting talk. In fact, what happened next is generally thought to be the closest the world ever came to nuclear war, despite both countries knowing that many millions of innocent people would die. In the middle of the crisis, JFK was under pressure to launch an attack, which he knew would mean a full-scale nuclear war. RFK, who was then the U.S. Attorney General, told the Russian ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, "We are under severe stress. In fact, we are under pressure from our military to use force against Cuba." He then said, "Please pass this message to Khrushchev through unofficial channels." He said, even though the president is against any action against Cuba, an irreversible chain of events could occur against his will. Against his will. This is important to understand. JFK knew when people such as General Curtis LeMay said hit them now and be done with it, they were deadly serious. In that particular instance, JFK replied sarcastically, "And what do you think the reprisal would be?" JFK later told his friend and special assistant, Dave Powers, "Can you imagine LeMay saying something like that? These brass hats have one advantage in their favor. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive to tell them they were wrong." JFK and Khrushchev came to an agreement. Khrushchev withdrew those missiles from Cuba. The U.S. did the same in Europe, but that was done in secret, so Mr. Khrushchev lost the vote of confidence in Russia. He was seen as a weak man for trying to save the world from obliteration. JFK later told the historian Arthur Meyer Schlesinger Jr., "The military are mad. They wanted me to do this. They were also mad at him, not just mad in general. They got even madder when he made his commencement address at the American University in Washington on June 10, 1963. He started the speech by telling the students in attendance he wanted to focus on one topic: peace. His words have gone down in U.S. history. To understand why he was taken out, you need to hear some of his speech. Like Eisenhower before him, JFK understood the danger of what had become what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. What kind of peace do we seek? JFK asked. Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on Earth worth living. The kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Music to the ears of many Americans, but not what the military-industrial complex wanted to hear. He was talking about wasting billions of dollars on nuclear weapons that could destroy the world. He said peace would not be easy, but the U.S. and its enemies should work toward mutual tolerance, and he added that disarmament was favorable to war. He even had the nerve to say, "Let us re-examine our attitudes toward the Soviet Union. A war with this enemy," he said, "would destroy all we have built, all we have worked for." He said he hoped our military forces are committed to peace and disciplined in self-restraint. Our diplomats are instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility. He said the words peace and disarmament. The word peace for the Pentagon is like garlic for a vampire. Did JFK really mean it though? Was he serious about disarmament and ending the Cold War? Documents on this matter and his actions say yes, he was serious, according to the conspiracy theorists. With all of these talks of peace and disarmament, JFK had basically put a target on his head. Then on July 25, 1963, JFK delivered a 26-minute televised address on the nuclear test ban agreement. He and Khrushchev had agreed not to test new nuclear weapons. Kennedy told Americans in their living rooms that since the nuclear weapons had been created, all mankind has been struggling to escape from the darkening prospect of mass destruction on Earth. This was not disarmament, but he did say a journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step. On October 11th that year, he signed the initial order to withdraw 1,000 troops from Vietnam. That target on his head got much bigger. In Action Memorandum 263, he said that the major part of the U.S. military task in Vietnam can be completed by the end of 1965. This memorandum later came out in the Pentagon Papers. Even so, when JFK signed that order, the CIA was doing things in Vietnam that he had no control over. The reporter and editor for the Washington Daily News, Richard Starnes, wrote that the CIA had penetrated every branch of the American government in Saigon. They ran the show. There was what Kennedy wanted in Southeast Asia, and there was what the CIA wanted. They were out of control, and always had been, which is why Kennedy said he would splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. He said this about an agency that hired mafia assassins to take out politicians and had an assassination manual that talked about throwing people from buildings to make their deaths look like an accident. The manual explained in some cases, a CIA assassination must be made to look like it was committed by a fanatic of some sort. It added politics, religion, and revenge are about the only feasible motives, although it is intended that the assassin die in the act. You'll hear more about this kind of fantastic assassin later, but first, let's finish this first part of the show. Our motive explanation with National Security Memorandum 239, which was titled U.S. Disarmament Proposals and was signed by John F. Kennedy. It said, "I have in no way changed my views of the desirability of a test ban treaty or the value of our proposals on general and complete disarmament. Further, the events of the last 2 years have increased my concern for the consequences of an unchecked continuation of the arms race between ourselves and the Soviet bloc." He wanted again to talk about general and complete disarmament of nuclear weapons, and he said he would be the one to lead the talks and make this happen. He was effectively talking about ending the arms race and possibly the Cold War. He meant what he had told those students about peace and stopping humanity's slow crawl to total annihilation. Ending the Cold War, say the conspiracy theorists, was about as much as JFK's official foes could take. The target on his head was shining like the North Star on a clear night. Kennedy now only had a few months of his life left to live. Now, you have a motive, but as yet, no evidence. On October 31st, 1957, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald arrived at the American Embassy in Moscow and met the consul, Richard Snyder. Oswald, who 2 months before had been discharged from the U.S. Marine Corps, told Snyder he wanted to renounce his U.S. citizenship. He then handed Snyder a letter that explained, "My allegiance is to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics." In an era of rabid anti-communism in the U.S., this was incredibly risky, especially if Oswald ever returned to the U.S. Soviet officials who were present were led to believe that Oswald might know something of special interest. Oswald said he would make known to them all the information concerning the Marine Corps and his specialty therein. All of this is documented. But what did he know? Wasn't he just a regular soldier, as people were later told? It's often said that Oswald was a kind of nobody in the military, but his job as a radar operator at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan was not a nobody's job. This is a crucial base of operations for the CIA as it acted as its headquarters in that part of the world. With one more base in the region, this was where the CIA's very secretive U-2 spy planes took off from. This program was run by CIA officer Richard Bissell, who worked closely with CIA Director Allen Dulles, both of whom were tasked with using these planes for spying missions over the Soviet Union. Rather than a nobody, Oswald had crypto clearance at the radar control room where he worked, meaning the most top secret of top secret clearance. Oswald often listened to the radio communications of the U-2. He certainly would have known many things the Soviet Union would have wanted to know. Marine Corps Lieutenant John E. Donovan was later Oswald's officer at another base where Oswald had the same access to ultra top secret information. But what's incredibly strange is that when the Warren Commission later interviewed Donovan about Oswald's involvement in JFK's death, They asked not one thing about Oswald's U2 work and his access to top-secret information. You'd think that that would have been important, say the conspiracy theorists. When Donovan was asked about that years later by a writer, he told the writer that he actually asked the Warren Commission investigators, "Don't you want to know anything about the U2?" They replied, "We asked you exactly what we wanted to know from you, and we asked you everything we wanted for now, and that's all." Donovan then asked another guy from the program if they had asked him about Oswald's U2 work, and he confirmed that he wasn't asked about it either. Weird. It's also weird that 6 months after Oswald defected, the first U2 plane was shot down by the Soviets. It was as if they had insider information. But guess what? When a year later Oswald returned to the US after some factory work in Minsk, the Americans who had been made aware of Oswald's possible connection to the U2 attack allowed him to walk right back into the country without a problem. They gave him a passport and even a loan just 24 hours after he applied for the passport. This was insane considering that Oswald had worked on classified spying technology and defected to the enemy shortly after. Many would see this as treason. Something fishy was going on. People who later wrote about this said every single obstacle was removed for Oswald on his return to the US. The Warren Commission never uttered a word about Oswald's crypto clearance and his U2 work. But why? Something else the Warren Commission didn't talk about was the fact that Oswald worked near the CIA site in Japan, where MK-Ultra mind control experiments were conducted on captives and its own soldiers. A CIA memo declassified just recently, titled "Truth, Drugs, and Interrogation," tells us that the CIA dosed agents who performed dangerous overseas missions. Maybe the Warren Commission didn't know about the mind control stuff, but that would be surprising since the commission used CIA and FBI personnel for the investigations. Yes, some say the CIA was tasked with investigating a crime it had committed. Former CIA agent Victor Marchetti, who wrote the book saying many things the CIA did not want to be published, said back then the CIA ran an operation from the Office of Naval Intelligence in which young men were to appear like they were angry at the US and disenchanted with its capitalist ways. They were then sent to the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe as spies. About 40 men were in the program, each of them trained at Nags Head, North Carolina. They learned how to act and what to say, with the Americans knowing the KGB would pick these men up at some point. The Americans hoped the KGB would try to turn them into spies, making them valuable double agents. Is that what Oswald was doing when he went to the Soviet Union? Very possibly, say the conspiracy theorists. Oswald's former roommate in the US, James Botello, said Oswald's whole pro-communist thing was a total lie, a pretense. He told writers that Oswald was actually anti-communist. He added, "I was sure that Oswald was on an intelligence operation in Russia." He said when Oswald returned and was welcomed back with open arms, not even being questioned by US police or intelligence, he knew Oswald was definitely working for intelligence. Moreover, considering Oswald defected to the USSR and told the guys at the embassy on record that he had information to give the Soviets, how come he could move around without constantly being surveilled? How did he manage to kill JFK with that kind of history, with the CIA knowing he was working where JFK would one day pass? The conspiracy theorists say this guy makes about as much sense as the movie Inception. Well, I mean, they didn't exactly say that, but you get the point. It's believed a man named George de Mohrenschlitt was Oswald's CIA handler. In 1977, he gave an interview saying this was true. He explained that a CIA agent named J. Walton Moore put him in touch with Oswald. Mohrenschlitt said, "I would never have contacted Oswald in a million years if Moore hadn't sanctioned it." The New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, depicted in the movie JFK by Kevin Costner, called Mohrenschlitt a CIA babysitter. Garrison said some of Mohrenschlitt's family told him Oswald had been made a scapegoat for JFK's assassination. Mohrenschlitt's wife and daughter said on record that he was the one who got Oswald a job in Dallas at a graphics arts company. This firm, Jaggers, Childs & Stovall, was, according to the Warren Commission, just a regular commercial advertising outfit, and left out the fact that the company made highly classified maps for the US Army, possibly maps of Cuba and the Soviet Union, which Oswald could have helped with. 3 hours after Mohrenschlitt opened his mouth about his relationship with Oswald, he was found dead in a house in Florida. This happened just minutes after Gaten Fonzie, an investigator with the House Select Committee on Assassinations, had come knocking at his door and left a card. The writer James Douglas, whose investigations we've used a lot today for this show, believes Mohrenschlitt was just a pawn in the game. Garrison understood only too well that people who talked tended to suddenly die. which is why he hid one female witness we'll discuss later. We'll also show you a bunch of very mysterious deaths. The man running the CIA's counterintelligence programs from 1954 to 1967 was James Jesus Angleton. This Yale graduate was a fervent anti-communist and was the head of the CIA's assassination program, which he ran with Army Colonel Boris Pash. The latter is more famous for investigating Robert Oppenheimer for alleged spying activities for the Soviets regarding the atomic bomb. Pash also led the Alsace mission when the Americans tried to grab Nazi scientists who'd worked on the atomic bomb and chemical weapons. After that, he took charge of the CIA's so-called wet affairs, which were assassination and kidnapping programs. When the Church Committee and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, HSCA, looked into such men, they found that Angleton's Special Investigations Group had a file on Lee Harvey Oswald. It was called a 201 file. The CIA had this on Oswald for 3 years before JFK was killed. The Warren Commission had not found this, and if it had, things might have turned out very differently. 201 files were for CIA operatives that needed to be watched closely as they become suspicious. But what's also interesting here is that documents were unearthed that showed the CIA had been creating phony 201 files for the ZR Rifle project, which was related to the assassination of political leaders. The reason that some of these files were forged was so the CIA could one day use that person as a scapegoat. They could say, "Look, we already knew this agent was up to no good," and then place all the blame on him. The HSCA interviewed a woman named Ann Egerter. She worked for Angleton and had seen Oswald's 201 file. It was her testimony that showed us that Oswald was actually a CIA asset, but one who was under investigation by the CIA, or perhaps being set up to become a scapegoat. We should say that she was indirect with her answers when interviewed, but researchers now say her testimony implies strongly that either Oswald was indeed a member of the CIA or was being used in an operation involving members of the CIA. The former CIA finance officer Jim Wilcott also backed up the fact that Oswald was a CIA asset. Wilcott became a whistleblower who said he left the CIA when he realized the work they were doing had nothing even remotely to do with humanism. His wife, who was also CIA, left too. They both testified that by leaving, they'd be able to sleep better at night. Jim testified that another reason was that while working at the Tokyo station, other loose-lipped CIA agents told him the CIA killed JFK. Jim testified, "I thought these guys were nuts, but then a man I knew and had worked with before showed up to take a disbursement and told me Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA employee. I didn't believe him until he told me the cryptonym under which Oswald had drawn funds." Jim then realized that he himself had advanced funds to this same cryptonym, which in his eyes made him partly involved in his beloved president's assassination. In 1978, after Jim had left what he saw as a disgraceful agency, he told the San Francisco Chronicle it was common knowledge in the Tokyo CIA station that Oswald worked for the agency. It was also widely known that he'd been employed to become a double agent spying on Russia. Jim explained Oswald was recruited from the military for the express purpose of becoming a double agent assigned to the USSR. More than once, I was told something like, "So-and-so is working on the Oswald project back in the late 50s. He added, "One of the reasons given for the necessity to do away with Oswald was the difficulty they had with him when he returned. Apparently, he knew the Russians were onto him from the start, and this made him very angry." After this kind of talk, both Walcotts had their lives made very difficult, which, as you'll soon see, happened to many people. They were followed everywhere they went. They struggled to find work. Their car tires were slashed. They regularly received threatening phone calls. Now we should talk about Richard Case Nagel, a CIA double agent who was arrested on September 20th, 1963 after walking into the State National Bank in El Paso, Texas, and firing 2 shots into the ceiling. He said he'd purposely got himself arrested because I would rather be arrested than commit murder and treason. Nagel had worked for Field Operations Intelligence, which was tasked with covering up the true nature of the CIA objectives. As a double agent, he also worked for the KGB, and one of his tasks was surveilling Lee Harvey Oswald. Nagel admitted all of this later at a time when fewer people believed Oswald had acted alone in killing JFK, or even acted at all. Nagel also said the KGB knew about the JFK assassination plot before it happened. He said if anyone wanted to stop the assassination, it was the KGB. JFK was a much better leader for the Soviets than anyone who might replace him. The KGB told Nagel to either kill Oswald or to at least try to convince him that he was being set up to become a patsy. he told him when he met Oswald in New Orleans. Nagel also sent FBI boss J. Edgar Hoover a registered letter saying he'd been ordered to kill Oswald and that there was a plan to assassinate JFK. Nagel believed that he would somehow be implicated in this assassination, so he got himself arrested. Jim Garrison interviewed him and later said he was the most important witness there was. Nagel said after talking to Garrison, he survived 3 attempts on his life and then agreed to stay quiet for a nice pension. But what about his letter to Hoover? He said he wrote it in a way to persuade the reader that its sender was familiar with CIA procedure, that it was not a crank letter. He used the alias Joseph Kramer, a pseudonym of a Soviet agent known to the US. Surely that would mean the FBI knew what was going to happen to JFK. The FBI has always denied it received such a letter. Since there is no letter, Nagel has been painted as a loon. But then, in 1995, the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, got in touch with Nagel, saying they would take him seriously as long as he told them everything and handed over every document he had that could show he was telling the truth. They mailed him a letter saying that on November 1, 1995, which was the day he was found dead in his bathroom in his house in LA. It was said to be a heart attack, in spite of him being in good health and having no heart issues. We should add that under MKUltra, the CIA worked on methods to cause people to have heart attacks. His son Richard was left the key to a storage lockup in Tucson, Arizona, where his dad had told him he kept all of his documents in a purple trunk consisting of everything about his time in the CIA. When Richard arrived, he found all of his father's things, minus the purple trunk. It was gone. It was also strange that the day Richard went to Arizona, his house was broken into and ransacked. Weird. We should also mention Thomas Arthur Vallee, the man believed to have been the CIA's first patsy, who was to be blamed for the assassination of JFK on November 2nd in Chicago rather than November 22nd in Dallas. This was only made public knowledge 4 decades after JFK was assassinated. Information about Vallee, the fact that he looked like Oswald and had a background similar to Oswald's, was never made available to federal agents in Dallas at the time of JFK's visit. The assassination in Chicago failed, but Vallee was still arrested. The file on Vallee said he was a far-right-wing lunatic obsessed with guns, a loner, and paranoid. This fits perfectly with what the CIA like to call lone actors when they need to blame a crime on someone. The Secret Service had learned about the Chicago assassination plot, so raced to Vallee's house where they found an M1 rifle and 500 rounds of ammunition. They told the Chicago police to watch this man 24 hours a day. A day later, policemen Daniel Groth and Peter Sherla pulled over Vallee's car and found a hunting knife in the back. In the trunk were 300 rounds of ammunition. When investigators later interviewed Vallee, he told them he'd worked in Japan on the secret U-2 program. They found his car's license plate had been frozen. Journalists were told the plate information was classified. As for those 2 detectives, they went on to have astonishing careers in police intelligence. The academic Daniel Stern investigated Groth's police career and said he'd never had anything close to a normal career. He went missing for long periods. He and other researchers said Groth actually worked for counterintelligence. Had they been part of a plot to make Vallee a patsy, placed there just in case the assassination was successful? Vallee's sister, Mary, believes her brother was set up as a potential assassin. She said Thomas was never the lone nut he'd been portrayed as, although he did have a history of some mental health issues. That's why he was honorably discharged from the Marines in September 1956. What's more, Vallee later told the journalist Edwin Black that he'd worked for the CIA at a training camp in Long Island, training Cuban exiles in the art of assassination. Just like Oswald, he'd somehow managed to find a job right where the Chicago assassination attempt would happen, where JFK's motorcade would pass. It was as if his life was the double of Oswald's. Later investigation showed Vallee also had access to a window at his new workplace that had the perfect view of the motorcade that was to pass through Chicago. Secret Service heard that 2 snipers with high-powered rifles were believed to be waiting for the president to pass through. The Secret Service, now knowing about the threat, arrested 3 men as possible snipers, and another 2 men were being held. These men were in custody just as the Chicago cops arrested Vallee. The possible snipers arrested that day also didn't become known to the public for decades. Abraham Bolden, the first black person to ever guard a president, was there in Chicago. He later said he couldn't understand why some of JFK's security was so lax. He said some of the men were drunk half the time. Bolden started drawing lines between what happened in Chicago and what happened in Dallas. On May 17, 1964, he tried to call the Warren Commission about this, but he didn't get through. On May 18th, he was arrested, and accused of trying to sell Secret Service files. He was disgraced, even though there was hardly any proof. At his home in Chicago, as he sat in prison, his garage was burned down. A shot was fired through a window, scaring his wife and kids. When he spoke with Jim Garrison, he was subsequently put in solitary confinement. In 1995, when AARB got on the case, the Secret Service destroyed all records of the Chicago plot after AARB investigators asked for access to them. So, the theory goes that Oswald was framed, but to frame him, he needed to be seen doing a lot of sketchy things prior to the investigation. More than just going to Russia or seeming like he was pro-Cuba. That's where his double comes in. Prior to the assassination, there were many sightings of a man who looked like Oswald. He was seen at a firing range on a few occasions. The theory says that the CIA was trying to make this man look guilty by sending a body double to the local firing range. One of the witnesses in the Warren Commission, Malcolm Price, said someone who looked like Oswald asked for help with his scope at a Dallas firing range. The witness, Garland Slack, said he was at another firing range, and this Oswald character drew attention to himself by burning up his ammunition on Slack's own target. Slack said when he complained, the man gave him a look he would never forget. The problem was, when the Warren Commission was told about these events, Oswald was supposed to be in Mexico City, visiting the Russian and Cuban embassies. There were too many Oswalds. The conspiracy theorists say they weren't just setting up Oswald, but indicting the whole of the Soviet Union in a Cold War they needed the American public to support. 4 days before JFK was shot and killed, the Soviet embassy in Washington received a letter written by Oswald, or at least signed by Oswald. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI read the letter before it ever got there. In the letter, Oswald admitted to meeting with Valery Kostakov, the KGB's undercover assassination specialist. So the man who apparently killed the JFK 4 days prior to killing him sent a letter talking about hanging out with the Soviet assassin. This was a perfect setup. But how do we know Oswald wrote the letter? Asked the conspiracy theorists. The Russian ambassador wrote, "This letter was clearly a provocation. It gives the impression we had close ties to Oswald." He said the U.S. must have been aware of the letter. He added that whoever wrote it was no doubt behind the assassination. When Lyndon Johnson became president after JFK, he actually decided not to scapegoat the Soviet Union, but he didn't question the fact that Oswald was guilty. The Warren Commission would later make out that Oswald's plan was to escape by plane to Cuba after he knocked off the president. This obviously didn't happen since Oswald was arrested and later shot dead by someone we'll discuss later, Jack Ruby. Maybe not a man who you think he was. Oswald didn't fly away, but it had to look like he had planned to do it. The patsy needed a fake getaway. On November 20, 1963, a car drove into Red Bird Airfield just outside Dallas. It parked close to the American Aviation Company, a private airline. One man stayed in the car and a woman and a guy entered the office. They said they wanted a Cessna 310 for November 22nd and wanted to fly to the Yucatan in Mexico, not too far from Cuba. Wayne January, who was the owner, became suspicious when they asked lots of strange questions such as how far the plane would go, at what speed, and where else they could fly besides Mexico. These were amateur-sounding questions, the type a kid or criminal would ask. January also said he looked in the car at the guy that didn't come in, and not surprisingly, he said it was Lee Harvey Oswald. He said that after the assassination, of course, Red Bird Airfield was just 5 miles from where Oswald lived. In 1991, through a Freedom of Information request, a British man named Matthew Smith got hold of the FBI's report on the Red Bird Airfield incident. Smith then flew into the U.S. to find Wayne January and told him what the FBI had said about the incident. January was shocked. The FBI had written that the incident occurred in July, not November, 2 days before the assassination. It also said January had been unsure about it being Oswald in the car when he had told him it was for sure him. His exact words were, "I gave them a 9 out of 10 chance." The reason for all the lies, say the conspiracy theorists, is that in January's testimony he said he thought those two people were thinking about hijacking a plane to Cuba. After President Johnson decided not to implicate Cuba or the Soviet Union in JFK's death, they now didn't need this Red Bird Airfield incident. It had to be played down. Just half a day after the Red Bird incident, a police lieutenant in Louisiana named Francis Frug was called into a hospital in Eunice, Louisiana. There he met a woman who was in withdrawal from opiates. Her name was Rose Charmaine. She said she'd been driving with 2 men, who later threw her out of the Silver Slipper bar that they were drinking at, and she got run over. Frug took her to another hospital where she could have her withdrawal in more comfort. And on the 2-hour journey, Charmaine told him The two guys she'd been driving with had told her they were going to kill the president when he arrived in Dallas. She said they were either Cubans or Italians. He didn't, of course, think so much of it since she was in a bit of a state at the time. But when 2 days later JFK was shot, Frug called the hospital and told him not to let Charmaine out of there. He couldn't believe it. Had she really known? After JFK was killed, they contacted the FBI about what she had told them, and they were told they already had their man. They didn't want to know about Charmaine's story. In a strange twist of fate, it also came to light that Charmaine had once worked for the nightclub owner, Jack Ruby. She also told Frug that through Ruby, she had met Lee Harvey Oswald. She explained that Ruby and Oswald were actually quite close. She never got to testify in the subsequent JFK investigations. On September 4, 1965, she was found dead in the middle of a road in Big Sandy, Texas. The driver of the car that had hit her said that he had swerved to miss some suitcases piled in the road. Only when he swerved, he went over a body. It's never been explained why a woman at 3 in the morning was lying in the road next to a pile of suitcases. Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who later wrote the book about JFK's assassination, said her autopsy showed the kind of head wound that's usually associated with a gunshot wound. She might not have even been hit by the car. Jim Garrison wanted to exhume her body, but the state of Texas refused his request. When Mac Manuel, the owner of the Silver Slipper, was later interviewed, he identified the two men that she was with as Sergio Smith and Emilio Santana, two Cuban exiles. Santana told Jim Garrison that he had worked for the CIA in 1962 when he first got to Miami. He was involved in moving weapons on the sea for guerrilla fighters in Cuba. The CIA admitted to using him but said they terminated his contract in 1963. Charmaine's story might sound unbelievable, but it's just a little bit strange that she talked about knowing JFK was going to be killed at a time that she was seen with Cuban CIA operatives. The conspiracy theorists say this is just one coincidence of hundreds of strange coincidences. As for the other man, Smith, he'd once been arrested in Venezuela on charges of plotting to kill President Ernesto Betancourt, the so-called father of Venezuelan democracy. Records show Smith was released from prison and the U.S. Embassy came to his aid. He went straight to New Orleans, where he worked with a Cuban exile group, and it was there he befriended the detective/intelligence agent Guy Bannister, who also knew Oswald. Small world, eh? Say the conspiracy theorists. Bannister and Smith had offices in the same building, the Bolter Building. The witness, David Lewis, who worked for Bannister, later testified that Oswald and Smith knew each other. Okay, let's move on a little bit. 23-year-old Julia Ann Mercer said on the day JFK was murdered, she saw a green truck parked close to Dealey Plaza, where the president would be killed in 1.5 hours. A man exited the truck and pulled out what she described as a rifle case. The man then walked over to an area that would later become known as the Grassy Knoll. She said 3 cops were standing nearby and not one of them did anything about this man walking around with a rifle case. She then pulled up next to the truck and looked at the driver. She got a clear look at him, but only recognized him 2 days later when she saw his face on TV. She was absolutely sure the guy driving the truck was Jack Ruby. She said that well before anyone ever asked her questions about some conspiracy. After seeing the guy with the rifle, she'd been overheard telling her friends about it at a restaurant. Police officers later stopped her and told her she'd been heard chatting about seeing a man with a rifle, and what's more, the president had just been shot. She was then questioned for 4 hours at a Dallas police station. When Jim Garrison interviewed her later, he showed her and her husband the statements she had made to the cops. She looked at them, and she said she'd never said anything like that. Her actual words to Garrison were, "They've all been altered. They have me saying just the opposite of what I really told them." She said she'd been given photos to look at by the cops of who might have been driving the green truck. She picked up one of them and said it was him for sure. She turned it over and on it was written Jack Ruby. "They definitely showed me Jack Ruby and I definitely picked him out as looking like the driver," she told Garrison. Just imagine if this had gotten out before Ruby killed Oswald. It would have been massive, but the cops wrote that Mercer had been unable to identify the truck driver. She told Garrison that she told her family the day she saw Ruby on TV that this was the guy she'd seen driving the truck. She then notified the FBI that not only had she seen Ruby in the photo, but that she had seen him again on the TV. But this wasn't in any FBI report. The only thing the official report said that was indeed one of the photos she'd been shown was of Ruby, but they said she hadn't picked him out. Garrison told her the FBI report said she said the words air conditioning were written on the truck, but she told Garrison that she told the FBI the truck had no writing on it. "I clearly said there was no printing on the truck," she told Garrison, but that didn't stop the agents from spending 2 days looking for air conditioning trucks. She also told Garrison, "Neither of the signatures on these 2 pages of the affidavit are mine, although they are close imitations." On the day of the assassination, Sheriff Bill Decker and Police Chief Jesse Curry were both nervous. They knew the president would be exposed. Both of them had been told by the Secret Service to lighten security that day. Decker had told his men they were to take no part in the security of the presidential motorcade. The House Select Committee on Assassinations later said both these men were just following orders from the Secret Service, orders that proved to be fatal to the president. The Secret Service said that JFK was the one who didn't want officers all around him, but subsequent interviews refute this. Air Force Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who'd protected President Eisenhower before, said all the windows of buildings in the vicinity should have really been locked down with tape over the order "Do not open," but that never happened. There was a vacuum of security for JFK. Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig said just after the president was shot, he saw a man running down the hill toward another man driving a light green Rambler station wagon. He tried to stop them, but he couldn't get across the street and the car took off. Craig then ran toward the Texas School Book Depository to tell the Secret Service. There he met a man who said he was Secret Service, who Craig said didn't seem very interested in what he had to say. Craig later went to the police station and talked to Captain Will Fritz of the Homicide Division. By this time, Fritz said they had a man in connection with the killing. Craig asked to look at him to see if he was the same man he'd seen running toward that green Rambler. It was the same man, but how could it be? Oswald said that station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne. Don't try to drag her into this. Mrs. Payne, who Oswald and his wife had stayed with, owned a station wagon, but it was a Bel Air Chevrolet. This would all be refuted anyway when the Warren Commission would say Oswald walked out of the building and got on a bus. The witness, Helen Forrest, also said she saw the running man enter a green Rambler. James Pennington corroborated what she saw, while some witnesses said they saw a man in a hat and tan or brown sports coat. Carolyn Walther said she saw a man in the school book depository leaning out of a window holding a rifle. Marvin Robinson and Roy Cooper both saw a man running down the hill toward the green Rambler. The Warren Commission rejected all these reports of a green Rambler. They couldn't use them because when Oswald was seen getting into the Rambler, Officer Marion Baker and Roy Truly said they'd seen Oswald on the 2nd floor of the Texas Book Depository. What about JFK's injuries? His wife Jackie said, "I was trying to hold his hair on, but from the front there was nothing. But from the back, you could see, you were trying to hold his hair on and his skull on." The Warren Commission wiped these words from their investigation, saying they were in poor taste. What these words might also have done is help prove that her husband was shot from the front. We won't get into the magic bullet theory too much because it would make our story even longer, but just keep in mind that this very crucial fact was striked from the official report. On the day of the shooting, William Allen Harper was taking photos near the grassy knoll. He actually found a large piece of skull fragment, which he then took to his uncle, Dr. Jack Harper. Jack passed it on to Dr. Cairns, the chief pathologist at the hospital where they worked. Both Cairns and another pathologist looked at the fragment and said it was a piece of skull belonging to the occiput, the lower back of a human skull. 9 years later, a student at UCLA realized that the x-rays of JFK's skull couldn't have been the real thing if these pathologists had been right. The x-rays showed a different part of his skull was missing. The x-rays fit the official story, which said there was only one gunman. But the skull fragment those guys had looked at suggested there must have been more than one perpetrator, meaning JFK was also hit from the front. Dr. David Mantic, a radiation oncologist, later investigated the x-rays and determined they were not authentic. They'd been forged, he said. As for Oswald, he told the cops that when the president was shot, he was having lunch on the 1st floor. He then went up a floor to buy a Coke from the vending machine. A key witness whose testimony was ignored by the Warren Commission saw Oswald there at 12:15. Her name was Carolyn Arnold. She said she knew Oswald well because he was always stopping by her desk and asking for change for the vending machine. She said she knew the time when she saw Oswald as it was lunchtime. She went into the canteen for some water and saw Oswald sitting there with his Coke. She said he was alone as usual and appeared to be having lunch. This was apparently 15 minutes before he must have raced up 3 flights of stairs, set his sights on the president, shot him, and then escaped. JFK was also supposed to pass there at 12:25, so the killer was apparently sitting back and acting relaxed 10 minutes before getting ready for the shooting in a different part of the building. About 1.5 minutes after the shooting, Dallas patrolman M.L. Baker flew into that 2nd floor canteen, where he saw a calm Oswald. Baker then asked the superintendent, "Do you know this man?" Superintendent said yes. Oswald then finished trying to get a Coke from the machine. 1 minute later, the clerical supervisor, Mrs. R.A. Reed, also saw Oswald on the second floor. He had a can of Coke in his hands. They all testified that when they'd seen Oswald, he was not out of breath and looked totally calm, and yet the Warren Commission was trying to say he'd pulled off the crime of the century and moved about as fast as Casper the Ghost. 15 years later, Arnold found out that the FBI had changed her statement from seeing Oswald on the second floor to seeing him in the hallway off the first floor. "This doesn't make any sense to me," she told a journalist. Her testimony of Oswald calmly eating lunch just did not fit the narrative. There are many more witness statements as to what happened at the book depository and in the street, and many of them are contradictory or not very reliable. This has been discussed time and again, and yet no one can say with certainty what happened. So we'll move on to focus on broader aspects of the case. As you know, the Warren Commission said Oswald then killed Officer J.D. Tippit and later fled into a movie theater. This is only one story, though. There's another take on this tale, say the conspiracy theorists. The Warren Commission says Tippit pulled over Oswald at 1:15. They exchanged words, Tippit walked around the car, and Oswald shot him. Oswald hit him with 4 bullets, after which he took off on foot, reloading his gun on the way. The report says 12 people saw the shooter and at least 5 made Oswald out in photographs at the station. Calvin Brewer, manager of a shoe store, also saw Oswald. He said he saw Oswald acting weird, and then he went into a movie theater. Julia Postal, who was in the ticket booth, saw the man sneak in, so she called the cops. The time was 1:45. Even so, Warren Butch Burroughs, who ran a concession stand in the theater, claims to have seen Oswald at 1:05. He didn't see Oswald enter the theater, but he saw him inside. Butch said he was 100% sure of that. He also said Oswald bought popcorn from him at 1:15, exactly when Tippit was shot. Again, it was as if there were 2 Oswalds. 18-year-old Jack Davis also saw Oswald at this earlier time. Davis said he was weirded out because there was loads of space in the auditorium, but this guy sat really close to him as if he was trying to be seen. The man then got up and went to sit somewhere else. He proceeded to get up again and went to the lobby. Davis said Oswald returned about 20 minutes later, although Butch said the Oswald he saw instead went to sit by a pregnant woman. Butch then said after Oswald was arrested in the theater after being wrestled to the ground, he was astounded. He said he saw another Oswald like a twin brother. One Oswald was carted out of the front of the cinema, and Butch said he saw the other Oswald being taken out the back. Bernard Hare, who owned a hobby shop, saw the commotion out in the street at the front and then went into the back of his store where there was an alley behind. Regarding what he saw at the back, he later said police brought a young man out, they put him in a car and drove off. That was all fine at the time for Hare, but years later he learned that Oswald was taken out the front, which he said he knew was wrong because he'd been there and seen he was taken out the back. Both Hare and Butch's stories seem to suggest there were 2 Oswalds, as does the story of police officer L.D. Stringfellow, who said in a police report that Oswald was arrested on the balcony at the theater auditorium, but he wasn't. He was arrested in the main bottom part. So, who did Stringfellow see being arrested? And who was the Oswald that the motor mechanic T.F. White saw around 2 p.m. who was wandering around a free man? The other Oswald by now was in a police station. White saw a car that seemed suspicious, a red Falcon. He took the license plate PP4537. A man in a white shirt got into it, who White realized later that night when he saw the man on TV was Lee Harvey Oswald. But how had he seen him at 2 p.m. when he was apparently in custody at the time? White's wife said, "Say nothing, keep your mouth shut." Years later, a journalist got that license plate number. When he checked it out, it belonged to Carl Amos Mather, who worked for Collins Radio, a contractor for the CIA. The FBI then talked to Carl Mather's wife, who said Carl was very close to the deceased Mr. Tippit. It was she and Carl who broke the news to Tippit's wife after he was shot. 15 years later, Carl said he'd testify to the House Select Committee, but only if he was granted immunity from prosecution. There were too many coincidences, say the conspiracy theorists, too many connections, but the best one follows. The official timeline is further complicated by the story of Robert G. Vinson, who worked in the U.S. Air Force for the North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD. He saw the second Oswald too. He was on the same getaway plane as Oswald. Let us explain. Vinson wanted to go to Colorado Springs, which was home, so he went to Andrews Air Force Base and, as was customary in the Air Force, asked if he could hitch a ride on one of the planes. No planes were leaving, so he wrote his name and serial number on a sheet, so he was on the list to go next. He then went to breakfast, but halfway through it, he heard his name called on the loudspeaker. He was told a C-54 cargo plane was leaving for Denver. Great, he thought. The plane had no markings on it, and when he got inside, it was empty. He saw two men in overalls working on the plane, but strangely, they also had no markings on their clothes. Vincent was also surprised that no one asked him to sign the manifest, which happened every time he hitched a ride. When he was high in the sky, he heard a voice on the intercom say, "The president has been shot." The plane suddenly banked left and headed south. Soon in the distance, he was very surprised to see the skyline of Dallas. Two men in Dallas got on the plane, a taller man and a shorter man. He thought nothing of it until sometime later when he saw Oswald on TV and he knew he was the shorter guy. Both these guys got off the plane when the plane landed again. Vincent later said, "I couldn't understand why they were in such a rush." Vincent later found out the plane had landed in New Mexico. He eventually got home and sometime later he told his wife that Oswald had somehow been on his plane. His wife said he was nuts. He kept quiet about it for 30 years, and in all those years, despite immaculate service, he never got a promotion. Let's remember, he put his name and serial number down at that Air Force base. If the man really was Oswald, someone must have known Vincent had shared a plane with him. In 1964, Vincent was called in for what he was told was a special project. He soon discovered it was with the CIA. They put him through a series of psychological tests and then asked him to work for them. He refused as he had still had his ambitions in the Air Force. It seemed in the end he had no choice. His bosses later told him he was going to work with the CIA at Area 51 on the Blackbird SR-71 spy plane. The conspiracy theorists believed that the CIA wanted Vincent close, working on top-secret projects and unable to talk about his job. Vincent later said that he wasn't dumb. He knew that this work meant he was being asked to keep quiet about his plane ride. He later said he knew the CIA would never let him out of their sights. The CIA, he thought, could have killed him, but instead they hired him. But in 1992, when Congress passed the JFK Records Act and Vincent was already retired, he contacted Dan Glickman, a Democratic representative for Wichita, Kansas. Vincent now knew under the new act he was able to talk. Vincent's story made the news, and later it became a book. Investigations showed that the C-54 could have landed about 5 minutes from where White had seen Oswald in the Red Falcon. So this is how the second Oswald got away, according to the theory. After JFK was killed, the first man to inspect the body was resident surgeon Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who was then working at the Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. Jackie Kennedy was beside herself, he later said. She just recently tried to put her husband's brains back into his head. Crenshaw and the other doctors noted a small opening in the middle of JFK's throat, about the size of a tip of a finger. They'd all seen this many times in the ER. It was a bullet wound, an entry wound. There was absolutely no doubt about this, they said. They put a tube in Kennedy's throat as he wasn't breathing well, a process known as a tracheotomy. Crenshaw then looked at the empty cavity in the president's head, later saying that there was no doubt in my mind that the bullet had entered his head through the front. Still, on that day, the Secret Service took the body. This was not in line with the U.S. protocol. Coroner Earl Rose tried to stop them, telling them the chain of evidence meant JFK could not leave the hospital. The agents pushed him aside. They really wanted that body. As you know, the following autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, revealed something very different than what the doctors had seen. The conspiracy theorists say that the CIA's Alan Dulles made sure the doctors soon changed their minds and agreed it was possible that an entry wound could suddenly become an exit wound. There was one lone gunman, said Dulles, and you better make well sure you tell the story that fits that. Dr. Malcolm Perry changed his statement, telling a friend that men in suits had visited him. Secret Service agent Elmer Moore later admitted that he'd been told to pressure Perry. Moore said, "I did everything I was told. We all did as we were told." Crenshaw said in 1992, "We believed the medical truth would be asking for trouble. I was as afraid of the men in suits as I was the men who assassinated Kennedy," adding that anyone who would kill a president wouldn't think twice about killing a doctor. He wrote a book titled JFK, Conspiracy of Silence. He was subsequently smeared. It was reported how much money he'd made from the book. The Journal of the American Medical Association said in a paper that he might not have been in the trauma room that day. Doctors and nurses at least came forward and said he had, and that what he said was the truth. It didn't matter. Once he was smeared, there was always a shadow of doubt hanging over him, say the conspiracy theorists. Even the doctors that did the official autopsy were under pressure. They were told not to examine the throat. Navy Medical Corpsman Paul O'Connor was there. He said they were told to leave the throat because the wound was just a tracheotomy wound, not a gunshot wound. It got very tense, he said in an interview, later adding, "We were all military, we could all be controlled." Lieutenant William Bruce Pitzer, who was head of the Navy's audiovisual department, got something worse than a good old smearing, according to this theory. He worked on a 16mm film of the Bethesda autopsy. He saw everything. First-class corpsman Dennis David saw Pitzer working on the film. They both knew what they saw, that JFK had without a doubt been hit from the front. David later said in an interview, "I can assure you, it was definitely an entry wound." He said it was inconceivable that it could be anything else. David assumed that Pitzer had taken the film. He realized later what he had seen would contradict the evidence that a lone gunman shot JFK. Pitzer had in his hands the most important footage in America. On October 29, 1966, Pitzer's body was found on the floor of the National Naval Medical Center where he worked. The FBI said he was found in a pool of blood with a bullet wound to the head. The .38 caliber pistol was lying nearby. His family said straight away that what the FBI said happened could not have happened. Pitzer was neither depressed or suicidal. We know from his wife and friends that he was thinking about retiring from the military and taking a new job. David said, "They were afraid that he would take the pictures that he and I had seen, the 35mm slides and 16mm film, that he would have taken them with him." Pitzer was thinking about moving to a major studio, so David said they'd be afraid Pitzer would have given them this evidence to work with. Both the slides and the film have never been seen again. This allegedly incontrovertible evidence disappeared when Pitzer died. Naval intelligence went to see his wife, Joyce, after she died and told her not to talk to anyone. She kept quiet for 25 years. Even at 80, she said she was afraid if she spoke, they'd stop her pension. She'd actually been told something incredible, something darker than the dark side of the moon. A retired Army Special Forces lieutenant named Daniel Marvin had visited her. She said he told her in 1965 the CIA had approached him with an assignment. The job was to assassinate her husband. She always knew someone had killed him, but Marvin said he hadn't been the man to do it. He'd refused to take out anyone on American soil, but he was still telling her someone in the CIA had her husband killed. Marvin had been a Green Beret and later trained as an assassin at a secret training camp in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It was called the Special Warfare School. During that training, he and others were told that a perfect assassination of a government leader would consist of using snipers and setting up a crazed loon who could easily fit the description the public would believe. In fact, in 1966, the CIA asked Marvin to assassinate Cambodian Crown Prince Norodom Sihanouk and make it look like the work of Viet Cong. The operation was later aborted, but Marvin said his entire military career consisted of such black operations. He told Mrs. Pitzer that Colonel Clarence W. Pattern summoned him to the office one day and told him that he was to meet a company man. This company man asked him if he'd be willing to execute a man who was a national security risk. Marvin assumed this would be in Southeast Asia, where he worked before, so when he was told the target was William Pitzer and he was in the US, he refused to do it. He said he would only do it if Pitzer were abroad. Marvin later said in an interview, "It was common knowledge in Mafia and CIA circles that Green Berets were tapped by the company to terminate selected targets in foreign countries, whereas the Mafia provided the CIA's pool of assassins for hits in the US." Marvin was also in contact with Captain David Vanek. He said in interviews later that Vanek, who he'd trained with regarding assassinations, might have killed Pitzer. In 1993, Marvin went looking for Vanek, hoping that he would admit what they'd done in the 60s. He said when he contacted the Veterans Service Directorate, he was told Vanek did not exist. There was no record of him. That's when Marvin thought, they took him out too. But AARB found Vanek in 1996. By then, he was a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve Medical Corps. Vanek admitted to training at the Special Warfare School, but said he didn't know Marvin. He also said he couldn't recall a meeting with the company man and didn't know William Pitzer. An investigation showed that Vanek had worked for the CIA cover organization in Thailand from 1965 to 1967. As for Jack Ruby, while in prison a doctor diagnosed him as psychotic. He'd lost the plot apparently, even though according to documents discussed in Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, Ruby was perfectly healthy and in a fine mental shape when he was visited just days before that diagnosis, and each time before that. How come he suddenly started suffering from psychosis? The New York Times wrote on March 10, 1964, "Mind expert says Ruby was insane. Anything he said now would be the words of a madman," which the conspiracy theorists said came in handy for some people. The man who diagnosed Ruby was Louis Jolyon West, a doctor who became notorious in time for dosing people with large amounts of lysergic acid dithylamide in his top secret work with a MK Ultra interrogation, hypnosis, and mind control program. One of the most outspoken people about JFK conspiracies, and apparently how ridiculous they were, was the prosecutor and author, Vincent Bugliosi. This same man threatened to sue Tom O'Neill when, during the 25 years O'Neill researched his book on Manson, he discovered Bugliosi's famous book Helter Skelter was full of provable lies and completely missed the CIA's many connections to the Manson murders. It's just another coincidence that Bugliosi became a kind of spokesperson for the CIA and the US government in detailing how the conspiracy theories were not true. According to James Beard, who often played poker with Ruby back in the day, Ruby stored and shipped guns to rebels in Cuba for the CIA. The journalist Dorothy Kilgallen was working on a story about Ruby's CIA connections when she died mysteriously. She just had an interview with Ruby when she was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse, apparently from alcohol and sleeping pills. Next to her body was a glass with dust on it, as if someone had crushed some pills. In the CIA's assassination manual from 1952, in the techniques section, Part 3 describes how a forced overdose is effective and not easy to detect. Kilgallen had worked for 18 months on the JFK story, conducting numerous interviews. She said the Warren Commission report was laughable. She said she would shake up America with her story, and then she died. And according to the book, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, her death had CIA written all over it. Jim Garrison always said Ruby was working for the CIA, not as an agent, but as a mafia asset, as many mafia gangsters back then worked for the CIA in return for favors. Ruby knew if he killed Oswald, he would be next, say the conspiracy theorists. That's the way it went. At 3 a.m. the Sunday before he did it, he called police officer Billy Grammer. Grammer later confirmed the speaker was Ruby. Ruby told Grammer, "If you move Oswald the way you're planning, we're going to kill him." Grammer later said that Ruby was trying to foil his own assassination job so he wouldn't end up having to do it, and so die himself. The Dallas County Sheriff's Office received calls at 2:15 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. from a man saying Oswald was about to be killed. Even so, Ruby defied reason when he was able to get into the police station and walk right up to Oswald. This should not have been possible, especially after those 2 phone calls. You've heard a lot today, and there's more to this story, but what you've heard is the general outline of conspiracy theory that has convinced many people to question the official narrative. The question is, are you now one of those people? Now you need to watch Inside the CIA's Terrifying Sleep Room, or have a look at how they caught Charles Manson.